Thank you to everyone who is joining us live or who is watching this at a later time. My name is Yareliz Mendez Zamora, and I am the TPS coordinator at Flick. As a part of our campaigns, Flick is dedicated to continuous learning and critical analysis of our work. Flick's campaign, like many things in our lives, intersect. They come together at points. Today, we're going to be talking about the intersection of climate change and TPS. I want to welcome to the space Nahomi, our climate justice organizer.
Hey y'all, excited to be here, happy to talk.
Hey Naomi, thank you for coming, for sharing space with me Tuesday at 6 o'clock in the evening. We're talking because something that is unheard of is happening in the Caribbean basin. We have Hurricane Eta and Hurricane Iota who are hitting within 15 miles of each other. Let's talk a little bit more. Let's dive into what that means.
Sure. So pretty much, as everybody very much knows, we were hit with Hurricane Eta in Central America, which then turned into a tropical storm on the path to Florida, and it hit us twice. It cut through South Florida, went around, and then hit through North Florida, and then went into the Carolinas. Within a week of that storm sort of like hitting and dissipating, there was Hurricane Iota, which is the current situation that is happening right now, which is in the process of going through Central America, because I really don't think that it's over just yet. And that storm is the strongest storm of this cycle. It is a Category 5. It moves at a pace of 9 miles per hour the last time that I checked yesterday, and the winds are 160 miles per hour. So it is not particularly normal to have storms at the pace in which they came through and the distance and sort of like they covered. So what is happening now is sort of like historical. And also it is important to note that hurricane season ends November 30th. So on top of all of this, it's kind of critical that we've had 30 storms. And that is also one of the things that has never happened before. So it's just sort of like these records just sort of like going up and up and up and stacking on top of each other. And we are not really sure if this thing is over yet, because while Hurricane Iota was forming, there was a potential for Theta to come in and develop as well. And last time I checked, around like yesterday or so, it was dissipating and it was only rain bands, which means it's just like the temporary like periods of rain that we get during the day. But we have a propensity for flash floods, particularly here in South Florida. So it's really important for us to know. But yeah, no, we've just been stacking up records.
Yeah, and all of this, the conversation around Hurricane Eta and Hurricane Iota remind me of the conversations that were happening around Hurricane Mitch. For those of you who don't know, Hurricane Mitch was a Category 4 or 5 hurricane that hit Central America, and the destruction was unparalleled. It was something that had never happened in that region before. And for example, in Honduras, it was estimated that it set back the development of the country by 50 years. So after Hurricane Mitch, temporary protected status was designated to Hondurans and Nicaraguans. And this made it so that people from Honduras and Nicaragua who fit the parameters set up by TPS could have work authorizations and driver's licenses, and their lives changed. This is a program that under the current administration, there were threats to terminate it. There were multiple attempts to terminate it. And now we're hoping that with TPS and with seeing what is happening in our countries, that people respond in an ethical manner. But Nahomi, I want to talk a little bit more about what the storms and sort of the conversations around recategorizing and why this is important.
So the reason why the recategorizing needs to be brought up is because we are not in the same premises that we were 10, 20, maybe even 5 years ago. In the sense that with climate change, which is very much led by human activity, since it's the first time in the history of this planet that a species is able to sort of manipulate the environment in the way that we do, we have more water, we have higher temperatures, and higher temperatures and more water create more dangerous, more volatile storms that lead to the level of damage that we see in particularly this hurricane season. Um, and, we have these insane storms that move at like a glacial pace over the territory. Sometimes they even stall. In the case of Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas last year, where we basically saw it just sit there for 24 hours, just whipping the islands into absolutely nothing. And that should be a call for the officials that are involved in the categorizing of storms to maybe expand the scale of how hurricanes are labeled. Because if you have higher winds, if you have a faster pace of development, if you have hotter waters, you're gonna get extremely violent conditions for these storms to develop in and then therefore hit us in. So in order for us to properly explain and more so prepare for these circumstances, we need accurate assessments of what these storms actually mean. A hurricane category 4 that hits this year is not the same one that hit in 2002. You know what I'm saying? So we need a more accurate depiction of what is really going on within our surroundings. And there is a process that could develop into like a category 6 and category 7. It's more so adapting us into that system of scaling. So it is present. It was developed in the 1970s. It's more so looking into what is happening now and really considering like, whoa, like, is this really for us? And in my opinion, the answer is yes, because a category 5 is not what Iota is.
Thank you. And thank you for bringing up Hurricane Dorian, because this is where we see these intersections, right? We know that Hurricane Dorian was sitting over the Bahamas for a period of 24 hours. And we know that the destruction that it caused was something that couldn't even be summed up in words. And yet, when the Bahamas petitioned for TPS, they were denied the status. And it leads back into that question of how do we respond ethically to conditions that currently exist, not only in the recategorization of storms, but also in the way that we respond to the humanitarian crisis. Because these hurricanes, as their intensity grows, as their pace slows down to a crawl, leaves more and more destruction. My family is Nicaraguan, so my brothers remember Hurricane Mitch, and my brothers remember that for weeks the streets smelled. They remember that there was nowhere to go that wasn't wet. They remembered that the sun didn't come out for days. And more than anything, they also remember a sense of hopelessness and a sense of destruction. Now, you're right in saying that the hurricanes that we're seeing now are growing in intensity. So my heart is with the Caribbean basin as they struggle with Hurricane Iota.
Yeah, I mean, not only that, I feel like also the Gulf Coast, which has been pummeled. We've had 30 storms, and even if it didn't turn into a hurricane, a tropical storm is enough to create a ton of destruction. So when you see these states that rarely have the infrastructure to sort of sustain the level of damage getting hit time and time and time again, there needs to be a conversation around what accountability looks like. Because we know that the circumstances in which these hurricanes are created, which is very much by the level of emissions and just consumption and deterioration of the environment and sort of the extraction of labor and resources, it leads to these things happening. But not all of us even have the access to create that level of damage. But we're seeing that the most vulnerable individuals and the ones that have the least hands in that process are the ones that are being affected. So it's really like a conversation that goes hand in hand, because the same level of accountability that goes into granting sort of like a path to creating the circumstances for people to have a proper quality of life also intertwines with how we treat our environment and how we sort of intertwine ourselves with our surroundings, and we treat it there onward. So, it's definitely tough to sort of go through the hurricane season, because it's always just a game of like what's going to happen next. And in reality, disasters happen due to the circumstances that are preceding it. So if people don't have the infrastructure, whether it's through roads, housing, transportation, healthcare, etc., once that hurricane passes, it's going to create more damage than anything that could be preceded. So, having all of those safety guards there is extremely, extremely important. And that's like one of the main tenets of the climate justice situation, along with intertwining that with the rest of the areas in our campaigns, which is TPS as well.
Yeah, definitely, because we know that Hurricane Eta and Iota are going to have a negative impact on the infrastructure of the health system, the transportation system, the sanitary systems, and the educational systems in these countries. And Naomi, you mentioned something really important, which is that the people who are suffering the most right now aren't the ones who have done this incredible amount of damage. We know that, combating climate change, we need to also hold several other aspects of our lives accountable. And we know that the people who are suffering the most right now are communities that are Afro-Indigenous. So we're talking about El Pueblo Garifuna, we're talking about the Miskito Nation, we're talking about people who are continuously wiped out of the narrative.
Yeah, I mean, and that also brings in the conversation around indigenous land practices, and sort of the fact that all of this knowledge is delegitimized because it doesn't look Western enough, and therefore it's not applicable in the sense that it's just not wanted. And when in reality, these are the most sustainable and their most effective methods. And I think that it needs to be sort of reckoned with, because there has been a history of sort of like how development works within the United States, and the history that they have had in Central America, when you have incidents like the United Fruit Company in Guatemala and other companies that have just sort of like extracted so much from the land and the people. This is the point in time where you sort of get the receipts for that. And what happens is that you see arid land, which creates, with enough water, it can create a landslide. And the erosion and the lack of nutrients in the water can then create a lack of food production, when in reality, there's a lot of people that depend on the agricultural business. But not only that, people need to eat for themselves. Not everything is business. So this sort of like consistent push towards like making money, creating profit, and sort of like creating competition between everybody has led to these very unsustainable practices that create the right premises for things like this to happen. Because right now, what we're seeing as aftermath of these hurricanes is, for example, if you do not have money for funding for the infrastructure as far as drainage and sewage, if there are outhouses, that water is going to pump up every type of live sewage that is under the ground, which creates the conditions for diseases to come. So climate, when it is not treated the way that it should be, can lead to public health issues. And these public health issues can then affect everything else, as we see with the pandemic and how everything has stopped several times.
Exactly.
So we want to make sure that everybody's just sort of on the same pace. And we got a little update on the WhatsApp. But we want to make sure that everything is on the same pace and everybody's in the same wavelength of understanding like how these things affect and how they interconnect, because at some point we're sort of going to have to revert to indigenous land practices. And right now is a very prime time for not only that, because it's not just individual responsibilities, but also holding the feet to the fire to the people and the companies that are creating this level of damage. So that's my tea on that.
And I love that tea. It was amazing. I think that you're right on so many things. We know that after Hurricane Mitch, we saw a lot of diseases come out, including dengue fever. But I know that we are at the 15-minute mark. And so what I want to leave our viewers with is this. Our lives intersect. There is a connection between climate change and our immigration system, specifically looking at the history of TPS and what's happening right now in Nicaragua, Honduras, what's happening in the Caribbean. We need to understand that we can't greenwash our advocacy efforts and that we need to respond with in a way that leaves people with dignity, with their dignity intact. And one of the ways to do that is to expand TPS and offer permanent protection to the TPS holders who are already here. Naomi, is there something that you want to add?
Essentially, in order for this to stop happening or lessen the conditions for future generations, because now we just have to ride the wave that has been set, we really need to figure out what our levels of consumption are and how to tone them down. Here in Florida, we have an extremely active tourism sector, agricultural business, etc., that really need to take inventory of how they treat the environment and their surroundings. And if we do not sort of like account for our activities and how that impacts our environment, then these storms, among other things, because pandemics are also a reflection of climate change and our interventions in the environment, are just going to continue, and that's just going to be the way that we just go. So although it might be different might be welcomed. So, accountability with TPS, accountability with climate. That's all we got.
Thank you for joining me in this space tonight, Naomi. If anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out through our Facebook. Alrighty, have a good night, y'all.